Hello and welcome to our Season of Creation episodes of Prophetic Voices, Preaching and Teaching Beloved Community, a podcast from the Episcopal Church's Office of Reconciliation, Justice, and Creation Care, where we explore the season and the lectionary through the lens of social justice. The Season of Creation is celebrated September 1st through October 4th by Christians around the world as a time for renewing, repairing, and restoring our relationship to God, one another, and all of creation. I'm your host, Reverend Shaniqua, Interim Indigenous Missioner, and I'm so glad you could join us. In this episode of Prophetic Voices, we'll be discussing the lectionary for Sunday, September 28th, Proper 21. Our superb guests this week are the Reverend Canon Melissa McCarthy, who is canon to the ordinary in the Diocese of Los Angeles and is the chair of the Bishop's Commission on Climate Change. When she is not doing the work she loves, she can be found wandering the Sierra Nevada mountains or training her 2 working dogs. The Reverend Phil Hooper, who serves as rector of St. Anne Episcopal Church, Westchester in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. He is a contributor to several Episcopal publications and spent his free time exploring the landscapes and history of the Midwest with his fiancée, Matt. His sermons and writings can be found at byanotherroad.com. And last but not least, the Thoughtful Eli Crowley, who is from the Diocese of the Rio Grande, a member of the official youth presence at the 81st General Convention. He also serves on the task force on creation healing as Christian ministry. Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for being willing to be guests on the podcast. I'm so excited for this year's Season of Creation. Let's go ahead and get started. The Season of Creation theme for this year is peace with creation, and it could be interpreted as like being at peace with creation, or it could be interpreted as like bringing peace through creation or by creation. What is your take, or what does it mean to you?
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when I look at the theme is that part of what it invites us to is to find a sense of peace with the reality that we are part of creation, like peace with our own createdness by God. I feel in so many instances that a root of our estrangement from creation and all of the things that it leads to with climate crisis, etc., is because somehow we hold on to this idea that we are somehow separate from the rest of the created order, and that we translate our distinctiveness as humanity into separateness. And so for me, there is a sense of peace, or a promise of peace, just in recognizing that I am part of creation, that we are part of creation, and that somehow there is both a responsibility and rest in that to be found. So that's sort of what stands out to me with that phrase.
Yeah, I think for me, I really struggled with the peace with creation idea. And I think sometimes we use peace as a way to sort of mollify and keep people calm, like be at peace and everything's okay, like pretending everything's okay when it's not. And so I found myself reflecting on the peace of God, which passes all understanding, and what that peace of God, which passes all understanding, looks like when we're talking about the peace of creation. So I feel like there's a little tension there. Creation is a wild, wonderful, and unpredictable place. It has its own sort of rhythms and patterns and symmetries and asymmetries. But peace, I think, is something that we have to continue to work toward with God's help in this sense, especially given the climate crisis that we're in right now. I mean, I don't believe creation is at peace right now. And I'm not sure I want to be at peace in that.
It certainly does feel like we are in a sort of rebellion against, creation right now with the way we're running the world. And I think a theme we see throughout the Bible is that our rebellion against God is often a result of peace that we don't have with ourselves. And so we sort of need to surrender creation in a way. I'm thinking of this gospel passage, and I think it's also in Luke, where Jesus is saying this king with a stronger army is coming, and the best idea is to make peace with him. When we learn about climate change, we often hear the world will still be here regardless of what humanity does. And so coming to that realization, I think, is an important part of peace with creation.
I was thinking about, and Eli, you helped it, in Lakota, one of our words for peace is wo Lakota, which is the state when all things are in right relationship. And so when we think about peace with creation, how are we in right relationship with ourselves, with each other, with creation, and with God? And that kind of thinking about that, maybe peace with creation in terms of like being in right relationship. What liturgical ideas do you have for Season of Creation or for worship that highlights creation care?
First, and maybe most basically, fundamentally, I would commend folks, if they haven't had a chance to look at it, there are resources through the Season of Creation. And if that's anything for your community, that's a great place to start with ideas. So you could look up Season of Creation, just, and go to the main website for it. It's an ecumenical movement. And so they have ecumenical resources there. And there's also a website, newcreationliturgies.org. And that is a place that holds some authorized liturgies for the Episcopal Church, including Eucharistic possibilities. And certain dioceses their bishops have authorized those for use. I know here in Southern Ohio, those have been authorized for use this year. So I would check out those as starting points if you're sort of starting from scratch, trying to figure out how you might build this into worship.
I think also having the opportunity to worship in creation, moving outside the four walls of our churches and being in different spaces, maybe not always spaces that are what we might call beautiful, but spaces that are wild and engaging, and spaces that challenge. So, where I live in Southern California, we have desert spaces, which are beautiful in their own way, but they're a unique landscape. There's mountains, there's ocean, waterside locations of some sort. But I'm also thinking, spaces where there has been climate change issues. So for us, it would be, worshiping in a space that's been damaged by our recent wildfires. That has a really different impact. Being able to pray in those spaces, it's healing. It opens our eyes and our hearts to what's going on in the world in a very particular way. So I think sometimes we think, being outside in nature is this we can kind of domesticate that experience. And I'd like us to not do that. Yeah.
Yeah.
In the Diocese of Rio Grande, we've had lots of wildfires and followed by floods, just like many other parts in the Western U.S. And for our winter diocesan camp, we've gone down to those Rio Doso, which just recently had major floods. They weren't covered as much as the ones in Texas with Camp Mystic and all of that. But it was really touching. And I think one of the things that made those worship experiences centered on creation and our relationship with it was just the forms of prayer that we used in our own prayer book.
Yes.
I think Form 4, prayers of the people, you're praying for creation and justice, care, you're centering that. Eucharistic prayer C, you get your Star Wars in the world. And just using the correct language at the correct times can do so much.
Prayer book is amazing, for sure.
You all have me thinking, if you're out in the Western context, here in the middle of the country where I serve, one could also imagine doing a prayer service or a walk or some sort of gathering like in the post-industrial landscapes of some of our cities. What would it be like to go and have some sort of service of lament or repentance or renewal in a space where we sort of see the evidence of some of our misguided decisions as an industrial society? So all kinds of options there.
I'm also thinking about maybe some sacred sites, like indigenous sacred sites. Here in South Dakota, of course, we have the Black Hills, but there's different areas, I think, throughout the country and throughout the world that maybe might be an interesting place to think about having some. Obviously, we don't want to misappropriate or take away this worship space of indigenous folks in their traditional worshiping context, but something to think about. Let me shift us over to the gospel. And this isn't necessarily just about creation care, but it's the question that kind of stuck out for me. Jesus says, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced even if someone rises from the dead. What is the relevance of this in light of the creation? And it almost seems in light of the resurrection. And it almost seems as though this comment makes the resurrection less important. What is your interpretation?
I would definitely not say it. For me, it does not make the resurrection less important, but it does highlight a sort of an invitation to think about how we relate to the resurrection, perhaps. And I do find resonance in a creation care conversation. For me, part of what Jesus is saying is that essentially we are not saved and we are not transformed by spectacle. People, even if someone just showed up and sort of said, I'm back from the dead and I'm here to warn you about all the perils that you are engaging in on behalf of yourself and your children. We wouldn't necessarily, just by the shock or spectacle of that, have our hearts opened or transformed to the ways we need to live differently. And so I think in some point for this story with Lazarus and the rich man, Jesus is pointing to that futility, that something else is needed there in order for one to actually be transformed and to actually choose to live in a different way in a relationship with other people. To my mind, that actual thing that leads to salvation and new life and possibility is the intimacy of encounter with the other, whoever or whatever that other is. In this case, Lazarus, had the rich man ever actually engaged in relationship with Lazarus, things might have looked very different for him. In our case, we could extrapolate that into the sort of environmental crisis we face. And how might we actually be transformed by a real relationship with nature? Not just sort of a vague, generic sense of the spectacle of natural beauty, which kind of gets to what you were saying earlier, Melissa.
Yeah. Yes to everything you said. I think of the transactional kind of relationship that we, at least in the United States, have with nature. It's something that provides us things we need, but it's not necessarily something that we recognize that we are in intimate relationship with all the time. And the sense of not listening to Moses and the prophets and not being convinced, even if someone rises from the dead, to me really speaks to the way so many folks have turned, have denied the current climate crisis that we're in, which is just getting worse, especially with our current administration and their policies. And I may be a little focused on that, I think, but there's some really interesting psychology about that. Like there's some interesting psychology about why people are unable to hear what Moses and the prophets are saying. I mean, that's all through the Hebrew Bible, right? And of course, Jesus gets similar resistance. And I feel like the very clear experiences that people are having in the world, never mind in the US, around climate change and the inability to take that in and actually change our behavior is something that is a bit mysterious, but is deeply psychological to me. And the resurrection, I think, can get used as like, well, someday it's all going to be okay because Jesus and resurrection. There's a participatory element for us in this, I think,
yes,
that I don't want to lose. I think it's easy to go like, oh, resurrection, and forget that we actually are part of this with God.
Resurrection is not Deus ex machina resolution of our problems at the end. It's like, get on board now, friends. Yeah.
I feel like Jesus is warning us in the gospel about being numbed by the resurrection, which is a point you guys drove home very clearly. And one of the ways he's pointing us to that is this chasm that builds up between Lazarus and the poor.
Yes.
And the rich man, not only in the afterlife, but also in, our current time, because Lazarus was not unable, but unwilling to reach out and build a relationship with him. And so I think that's a great place to, maybe incorporate some ideas from the epistle, because we really have to reflect on what chasms are preventing us from building a relationship with nature and also the people that are affected by the climate crisis. There's this website I know of, I think it's called How Much Can I Give? And you put in your income and it tells you how rich you are compared to everybody else in the world. And I went on that and I put $36,000. It doesn't sound impressive, but somebody with that income in the United States, you're in the top 4% of the wealthiest people. And so sometimes when the gospel talks about wealth, we often think, oh, this isn't me. It's about the people that are powerful in this world. But we all have wealth, and we all have a responsibility to avoid letting a chasm build between us and nature.
It's not like some innovative new punishment that God came up with in the afterlife. It really was just a reflection of reality. Like that chasm was already there in the life of these people, created by a certain inattentiveness or denial or whatever, however we want to characterize it. But that in some sense, God is simply revealing to the rich man the truth of his own desolation and isolation that already existed. And sort of the invitation is for us to perhaps see how we too are trapped in those things.
Yeah.
I appreciate you naming that.
If Jesus told this parable today with creation in mind, what might it look like? I was thinking about like the chasm between our comforts in our house with our air conditioning and our carpet and, and then like actually going out, and how many of us, like if we live in maybe an urban environment where everything is concrete, where do we actually get to see the chasm between us and the created world versus the world that we created?
I think you can actually feel it from air conditioning units. I don't know. But in New Mexico, we use swamp coolers, and water is circulated through this moist cardboard to cool the house, and hot air is filtered out. And so if you walk in a dense area by some bunch of public buildings, you can feel the heat coming out of air conditioning units onto the street.
Yeah.
From the buildings. So if you're, using these air conditioning systems and there's a houseless person outside of your building, you are expelling heat out into their environment. It's kind of like this, you can see this environmental exploitation directly.
Yeah, very close in impact. I also think, the relative wealth that we experience sort of insulates us from where the worst climate change crisis is happening, which is in our equatorial countries, right? So, the chasm between us and places in that equatorial region and what they're experiencing in terms of flooding and all that, and the like very real threat that they're under, we still have the ability to insulate ourselves. We still have the ability to cool when we need to, and warm when we need to, and even provide cooling places and warming places for the unhoused. But places like, closer to the equator, when it floods, like there is nowhere to go. I mean, it's a whole different kind of devastation, I think.
I think in terms of this parable as well, if sort of the tragedy of the rich man is that really he realizes too late that he never actually understood the world around him or the communities around him or the possibilities of relationship that were all around him. One could imagine that parable translated into our context is like someone realizing that they never actually knew the earth that sustained us. They never knew the sources of abundance, and maybe who paid the price for that abundance in ways that we either through apathy or willful denial just refused to look at. I think the rich man, no matter our economic circumstance, I think to the points already made, that rich man and his being cut off from that sense of the truth of things is true for so many of us.
I remember we did a food project, like gardening project with this urban Indian community in a city that will go unnamed. But I remember like we grew carrots and all these vegetables. And then when it was time to bring them up, the kids were like pulling up, like she pulled out a carrot and she looked at it. She's like, what is this? And we're like, that's a carrot. And she's like, she expected it to look all polished and clean like they do in the store in those little plastic bags. And she's like, this is not a carrot. I'm like, yes, it is. Here, let me show you what to do. But it was so funny because she had been so removed from that
Yes.
she had no idea that that's what that was. And like, if ever, the zombie apocalypse were to come, I think we'd have some serious problems with people not realizing how they could survive. Let me shift us over to 1 Timothy. And I think this kind of may be part of the answer in some ways to the gospel. Because I'm thinking, what would it look like to practice contentment in a culture of commercialization and consumption?
One of the things I remember most from my high school years after just recently graduating is my 10th grade environmental science class with Miss Sandra. And she really got us into this idea of permaculture for building a garden and involved with plants that are appropriate for your climate, are useful, not decorative, and sustain themselves. And I really saw how it challenged, my ideals of like housing. In the United States, we want space from our neighbors. We often want our lawns to look a certain way, and we sort of manicure our, land in order to fit a certain way of living. And that comes out into policy as well. there's land being sold in the West in order to build housing that is spread out. And St. Paul, tells us to look at how our love of money and our desires for certain things often obscure us to the Lord's word. And so I think that the epistle, in the context of creation, is calling us to look at how our desires might be obscuring our relationship with creation. I know in the global south, in Brazil, eating meat is this huge social status sign, as it is here. And as a result of that, there's lots of deforestation in the Amazon and illegal ranching because of our being set in our own ways and not being willing to reevaluate and change our lives in order to build relationship.
Would also offer that we have an abundant resource in terms of reflecting on what it could look like to practice contentment in a particular way in the witness and life of our monastic siblings, both in the Episcopal Church and beyond it. I have been a guest at any number of monastic communities and been in conversation and relationship with various religious. And while that is not a life to which everyone is called, is a life that has for a very long time, I think, served as a model of an alternative way of being, one that is focused on interdependence, on humility, on shared resources, often on a relationship with the land, because so many of those communities have to sustain themselves in various ways. And so I love, as we face these big, very contemporary questions, we do also have these very ancient resources to draw upon. And Shaniqua, you're probably not shocked at all that I would bring that up, given my love for some of our deep traditions. But I was just at a monastery for a retreat shortly after Easter this year. And I have to say, my sense of connection with people and the land around me was so restorative to my spirit. And so, and such a stark reminder for me that I had become so disconnected from that rhythm of life in my sort of urban rushing around busyness. So that's another place for us to find wisdom.
I think there's, just in at least the realities of my life, I'm kind of regularly bombarded with things that I supposedly need to buy in order to have a fulfilled life. So making a commitment to consciousness around how I'm using the resources that I've been given. And also, I love this reading from Timothy because it makes so clear how taxing and how much work this kind of wealth is on the soul. So prioritizing our relationship with God in the present moment in whatever way we can, rather than looking to alleviate our anxiety about the future or the grief of our past, but really zeroing in on God's presence in this moment. And if we can do that, there's very little that we need. We need food, we need connection and relationship, we need some kind of place to rest our heads at night. That's where I think true life is found. So I think consciousness and staying connected in the moment to moment with God in relationship.
Would that all our parishes and other communities be places where we're learning to practice that together? Are we actually showing up, trying to feed each other and be fed by that sort of deep encounter with God and creation and one another? My longing is that our parish communities become even more those places.
I had an experience of starting at a new congregation and meeting a family. For some reason, I had gone to their house for some reason, and were sharing what our weekend plans were. And they said, "Oh, well, we're going shopping." And I found that going shopping ended up being a regular part of the entertainment of what people in this community did. That was so brand new to me. It just did not occur to me that when you have a weekend with time on your hands, that going shopping would be a great way to spend it. And that's a real thing. Very different than that kind of relationship you're describing, Phil, in the parish community and how life-giving that can be.
What does generosity and being generous look like for you? And that could be individually or collectively. And what might it look like, or what could it look like for the church? And Melissa, this is for all of you, but I'm definitely kind of thinking about like what you just said about the needs that we have. And then with the fires, I know a lot of people had to find places to rest their head and to food.
Yes.
And how did that work? And
wow. Well, I will say, I think generosity is an important part of the development of our spiritual life. Attentiveness, being aware of the needs around us, and then choosing to respond generously is a core part of our Christian practice. In our experience of having two communities in Los Angeles County on fire at the same time, there were a remarkable amount of needs to be met in a very, very short period of time. And so what I witnessed was profound generosity on the part of many of our congregations and parishioners who opened their doors to others, but congregations who opened their doors to anyone who needed somewhere to stay. Like immediately on the night of January 7th, fire broke out 6:30ish, I want to say, at the Eaton fire. And by 8:30 or 9 p.m., there were people offering shelter for folks. So yeah, attentiveness, generosity, really having the ability, really having empathy for what people experience and letting that inform the kind of decisions we make about the resources we have. What does it feel like to be someone who is forced out of their home? Maybe, and in the case of the Eaton fire, I mean, there was a whole community that was not evacuated. I don't know if you all know that, but the evacuation notice didn't go to the west part of Altadena. And so people in Altadena made the decision themselves to evacuate when they saw the fire coming their way. We assume that there's going to be an orderly, like, okay, folks, time to evacuate. You have 30 minutes. That was not the case for a large portion of the community that had to evacuate around the Eaton fire. People had to make their own decisions and figure out where to go. It was an invitation for the church to really show up in that moment, and they did. And they did so generously for weeks, providing homes and places for people to stay, food, clothing. I mean, people didn't have clothes. It was a pretty remarkable time.
I think you can show generous acts in every situation, not just in the worst situations.
mm-hmm.
I know St. Peter's in Oxford, Mississippi, where I've been recently, keeps the door to its sanctuary open all the time. And the pathways to the rest of the church are locked, but anybody can come into the sanctuary at any time. And not only is that good for providing a place of prayer and reflection, but it's also a fact that because of the way our church architecture is traditionally, they tend to be the coolest places on the street, not just because we have air conditioning. And so providing a place for people, especially when we're having more and more heat waves and high temperatures to welcome, has been a good way of doing that.
Melissa used the word a bit ago, attentiveness. And that was a word that was also sticking with me. There's a lot of conversation these days about like the attention economy, and sort of everything is and everyone is vying for our attention. The utter distraction that we face that leads to all kinds of social challenges, to say it mildly. For me, there's also generosity can also just begin with the question, where am I putting my attention? Where am I entrusting my attentiveness, my presence? Because, maybe all of us in various moments of our life, and those listening to this could probably say some of the most powerful moments of relationship, of connection in our life is when we were fully attentive and present to a person, to a place, to the needs that were before us, or the beauty that was before us, or just whatever was before us. And that oftentimes that is where true change begins. And so I think that generosity of attention is a place indeed that can start in any moment with any person. It requires not a dime, not a anything other than just ourselves showing up. And so much can flow from that.
I'm thinking of like the generosity is one of our 4 Lakota virtues. And I think I've said this before, but like our standard of wealth is not on how much you have, but rather on how much you give away. So it's based on how much you can give away. And that's how we judge how wealthy one is. So if you hoard it, you will not be considered wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that, like, we might not have a lot of money in our diocese. We have churches that don't have electricity or water or heat. But if somebody needs something, the people will open up their homes, people will cook, and they will be very generous in that way. How might generosity toward the earth and its people be a form of storing treasure for the future?
This actually makes me think of the first Old Testament reading, Jeremiah, because, we're in a context of Jerusalem being sieged. King of Judah buys this field at Anathoth, even though the future is uncertain. And as a result, the Lord promises abundance in the future. And so I think there's a very clear biblical calling to build a relationship with the land and reimagining how we use it on a personal level in our own parish communities and our homes, even though on a wide systemic level, it doesn't always feel like a lot of change is occurring, can build a lot of hope for the future. For example, planting a permaculture garden. I like to think of them as victory gardens, and eating more food locally can lessen your environmental impact quite dramatically. And you don't need to wait for the president or the Congress to do anything. There are steps you can take in your own life to change the relationship you have with land.
And I think it's probably important to step back and name sort of the lens that Eli is employing here on this First Timothy passage, because there are some folks in some spaces who may read the text where it says, thus storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life that really is life, and think of that very much in a sort of disembodied heaven sort of thing. Like we're storing up our merits for when we escape this broken, sinful earth and go to be elsewhere with God. But I think for many of us, especially those of us who are attentive to issues of creation care, but also more broadly in the Episcopal Church, which I think is a deeply incarnational Christian tradition at large, we are talking about, we may read this text more in the vein of how are we investing in this good earth that God has created and placed us within? How are we investing in this for ourselves, for the generations to come? Not only to be good human beings or good members of a global society, but because we believe, we proclaim that the resurrection and the new creation is the restoration of this earth.
Yes.
And that Jesus will come back to this earth, and that we will stand upon this earth with the risen Christ. And this is the place, this earth, this soil under our feet is the place where we are planting these good things, because this is the earth that God has made and called beloved and good for all of eternity. I think it's really important for us as preachers or whoever within the Episcopal Church to say, like, we are naming a different engagement with this sort of text, and we are proclaiming a different understanding of the promise that is really deeply embedded in Scripture.
I'm sort of noting the tension of storing up the treasure of a good foundation for the future, and the tension between that and also like kind of the opposite of the question that you asked, Shaniqua, which is how might generosity toward the earth and its people be a form of storing up treasure for the future? Well, how is hoarding the opposite of that? Our like hoarding for ourselves the things that we think we need in order to ensure our own futures, right? That's an act of isolation. It's an act that prevents us from being in relationship with others. And it's like in all senses deadly to us, physically, emotionally, spiritually. So generosity itself, giving of ourselves, giving of the abundance of our own life to the earth, to the peoples of the earth, is the only way we can create this treasures for our future. There's just no other way.
I was thinking about things like generations and how if we, educate children, that's storing treasure for the future, or if we ensure that they're going to be safe and have safe spaces to play and pray and live and all of that kind of thing is also storing treasure for the future. Maybe it's going to be a little bit political, but the gospel's political. But like, I think how much our society and elected leaders are not caring about the education of our children and our youth is appalling in that, like, what's going to happen then? Like, how are our kids going to know how to live and what to do? And we're shooting ourselves in the foot by not taking care to educate folks.
Yes.
Let me shift for a moment to Amos. This prophecy seems to be a warning to those of privilege and comfort. How do you read it, and what exile might we be headed towards?
Actually thinking about something that Melissa said earlier about how creation is, wild and untamed and uncontrollable. Right? It's not this domesticated thing just for our pleasure. It's something to respect and to, that can inspire some fear. Sometimes I think that the promise / threat / prediction of exile that shows up in the prophets is really in a sense is God warning the communities that if they do not engage in the care and mutuality that allows human communities to flourish and thrive and experience some measure of safety in this life, if we do not do that, then really what we are doing is degrading the gifts that we have been given, degrading the ways that we have been called to live in common life together and in harmony with creation. Mm-hmm. And instead, we will experience an exile, which is essentially to be cast out into the wild, sort of impassive, uncaring, in some ways morally neutral forces of creation, where we will have to fend for ourselves. The wilderness is an unprotected place. It is still a holy place, but it's an unprotected place. And God seems to say, if you persist in these delusions and these disfigurements of the life to which I have called you, you will have to go back out into experiencing the natural order of things so that our original intimacy can be restored, so that you can understand once again who you are and who I am as God, and that somehow, work your way back to the original calling that you were given. So I feel like this cycle of exile, as it's an ancient sort of realization that's still so present, that if we don't care for one another, we will have to bear the consequences of that and then figure out how to rebuild. The prayer, of course, is that we would realize sooner than later so as to head off the worst of that. But I'm skeptical sometimes.
One of the things that I really appreciate about the season of creation is the fact that it's ecumenical, right? There's a whole bunch of folks that participate in this across the world. And the decisions that are being made on our behalf by our elected leaders are decisions that are going back to that idea of hoarding, that are about like protecting us from these supposed threats out there. What it's really doing is cutting us off from being in right relationship with other folks, people across the world, right? So when I read Amos, I read the privilege that those who are at ease in Zion experience as similar to the kind of privilege we experience. And the exile I feel like we're headed toward is one that I'm not sure I can really imagine, but it's not good.
Right.
We're making some decisions are being made that are going to impact us for generations. And just this past, 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. So I actually find it a bit terrifying.
Because you're paying attention, Melissa.
Yeah, attentiveness. It's not always positive.
No, right? I mean, the prophets, they paid close attention, and they were some brokenhearted, angry folks.
How do we balance joy in God's blessings with the grief over creation's destruction? I feel like those are sort of in tension with one another sometimes. How do we do that?
I feel joy as a gift of God's grace. Joy is not something I can manufacture for myself. Joy is something that comes through my relationship with God in community. So it's sort of a point of entry or even a barometer for my own spiritual life. So, and to me, grief is, like you said, Shaniqua, it's intention, but it's also possible for those two things to exist at the same time, in the same place, within the same community. So I can feel joyful in community. I can feel joy in the or of the presence of God in my life and in what I see God doing in the communities within which I work and live. And I can also grieve with those same communities. One of the most profound experiences I have had as a priest was being present the first Sunday that the community of St. Mark's, who lost their church overnight on January 7th, the church and school burned to the ground. Being with them on their first Sunday in their new sort of temporary worship space at St. Barnabas Church in Eagle Rock. The joy in that community was like, if there was a joy barometer, it was off the chart. I mean, it was incredible. And at the same time, the tears and the grief were also so present. And to me, that's one of the mysteries of our faith. How this presence of joy and grief can be there at the same time and one not overshadow the other. They sort of inform each other. It is what it means to be a person of faith, to live in that joy and grief.
I agree wholeheartedly with that. I would actually say I think to seek balance amid joy and grief is not even necessarily the journey that we need to worry about. I think like the rich man, what we need to be concerned in the gospel passage, what we need to be concerned about is insulating ourselves from the fullness of that strange mixture of joy and grief that is the life that is really life, as First Timothy says. Sum up all these a little bit. Yeah, I completely agree with what Melissa just said. That, Jesus as our example surrendered himself fully to the joy and the grief that were both of God. And that, are God's own posture towards creation, the deep joy and the deep grief. And sometimes one is maybe more strongly experienced than the other, but somehow in the divine ecology that is grace, those joy and that grief, it all cohabitates and it all feeds itself into that fullness of life. I think what we want to be more fearful of is an apathy, is a numbness, is a denial, is a stepping back from that fullness of experience. That's where the real peril lies.
I think grief is also a companion. We only grieve the things that we love.
Yes. Which draws a person back to a fundamental question for the season of creation. Like, before you engage in this season, or however you do engage in the season, ask yourself, do I love creation? And what does that mean?
Right.
Do we be practicing a loving posture towards creation of which we are ourselves a part of? Or do we see it as something other than love? That feels so fundamentally necessary to consider that.
Love is not transactional.
Amen.
I think that in the parish system we have as Episcopalians, you always have a barometer of how your community is feeling, or at least a segment of it, based on your interactions you might have within that community. So just being aware of your fellow community members' life experiences and, just the events that are happening within your care geographically are an important part of life in the church.
So what tips do you have for preaching proper 21? I really like the conversation we had about Lazarus and the rich man. And I know I want to answer that question about the resurrection, because that was the one that stood out for me. And I'm guessing other people would have that same question. What other tips do you have, or where would you guys go?
I think First Timothy is a rich place to dig in, especially if one's wanting to really lean into season of creation, just because it explores an ethic of life. It asks what life really is about and how we participate in it. And I think you could very easily, enriched by other resources, you could very easily tie that into some of these fundamental creation questions.
I think there are a lot of invitations to action in both Timothy and Amos and the gospel, all three.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, I would have a tendency to be a little bit strident, and I'd want to temper that because I'd want to make sure that my people were coming along. And at the same time, I want to make sure that that what I'm preaching is one that I guess reminds us of our responsibility, but in the gentle yoke of Jesus kind of way, that the resurrection doesn't alleviate our responsibilities here, but compels us into those responsibilities. It's the thing that gives us the courage to do the work that we need to do, that we're being invited to do in these readings.
I think the reading from Jeremiah is also valuable if you're looking into creation, because when you place it in context, it is about investing in the land and storing up trust in God's promise in order to have abundance, so that houses and vineyards and fields can again be utilized properly. And so when you put Jeremiah in context, I think it's a really powerful thing, to hear about how investment might bring about abundance, not just for ourselves, but for others in different places in time.
Yes, 100% yes to that.
And faith. It talks about faith, right? Like the whole idea is he's like, I have enough faith that this will still be here, that I'm going to buy this and invest in it. So, I mean, yeah, wow. Thank you, Eli.
One last thing that I would add in terms of tips or thoughts for preaching this Sunday, or really all of Season of Creation, is how are you as a preacher letting creation speak through your sermon? How is creation itself sort of giving voice or image to the message of the gospel that you're trying to proclaim? And and not just creation in a sort of generic way, but maybe the creation that is in your local context.
Yeah.
So for me, in living in Southwestern Ohio, how is the landscape or the environmental concerns here, or just the way the land exists in this place? How is that maybe feeding into this message and the imagery that I'm sharing? Because if part of the purpose of this season is to develop a sense of love and attentiveness to creation, maybe we start with what's in our backyard, in our local setting, or the stories, of crisis or degradation that are happening elsewhere, whatever that is for your local context. Don't miss that as a resource for preparing for these messages.
Amen. Thank you so much for being willing to be guests on the podcast and sharing your wisdom and your stories. I really appreciate it. I know the listeners do too. Thank you. If you want to learn more about Beloved Community, visit episcopalchurch.org/beloved-community. If you want to learn more about creation care, visit episcopalchurch.org/creation-care. Thanks to our guests, Melissa, Phil, and Eli. Thanks also to our production team, especially Chris, Olivia, and Mike. If we helped you cross a chasm today, please rate, review, and of course, share our podcast. Until next time, let your light shine.